My name is Nicodemus. I'm a member of the Sanhedrin in Jerusalem. The Sanhedrin is the ruling organisation of our nation, except that above us there is Herod, who is the king, and Tiberius, who's the emperor. It's interesting that while Caiaphas is the high priest and leader of the Sanhedrin, he is appointed by the Romans. And the same is true of the king. King Herod is also appointed by the Romans. He's not even a Jew. He's just somebody that they get along with. So this is the nature of our nation. We are controlled by Roman authority, even though it looks a bit like we rule ourselves. There are two parties in our Sanhedrin. There's the party of the group we call Sadducees and the party we call Pharisees. The Sadducees are more like a secular type of Jewish person. They are more interested in power and structure and administration and the nation, the culture and that sort of thing. So it's logical that when the Romans choose a high priest, they choose from the Sadducees. They don't choose from the Pharisees. The Pharisees are the group which are related to religion. They work out the theology of the nation, and they're concerned about things that are religious and sometimes a little over-concerned about religious things. I'm one of them. I'm not one of the other lot. So within the Sanhedrin, there's a balance between these two groups. I'm here to tell my story because of something which happened recently, which I found really very offensive. The Romans had a rabbi who came out of Galilee put to death on a cross just recently. And even though I tried to make sure that he had a fair trial, that didn't work out. I appealed to the Sanhedrin to be honest and truthful and fair in their judgments, but they were not. And they took the whole business to the Romans, and the Romans, Pontius Pilate, ordered that it happen, and it happened. I find this to be overwhelming in a sense, because I had become a bit of an associate. I'm not sure I'm a believer exactly, but I'm an associate of Jesus because I have met him at least once. When Jesus was crucified, he had another supporter within the framework of Israel, who also within the Sanhedrin, a man named Joseph. And Joseph and I organised and took his body and placed it in Joseph's own personal tomb, so that Jesus at least was given a respectful burial. His trouble started well before this, but particularly one day when he came into the temple and he decided to upset things there. You know, he came in and he shouted things like, he shouted things like, "This is supposed to be a house of worship and you have made it a den of thieves." Well, that upset the authorities, didn't please the authorities very much, and so they began to plot. There are some of the Sanhedrin who already had begun to plot against him. The Sadducees saw him as a threat to their power, because he was thought about by some as the Messiah who is to come into the world and rule in Israel. Well, you know what that would mean for them? They would no longer rule in Israel, and so they needed to get rid of him, or so they thought. The Pharisees weren't very happy with him either, because he upset them with his theology. He seemed to want to always upset the Sabbath law. He kept on doing things that upset the law. He seemed to be turning over things. He was upsetting the tradition and the way we believe in God. And they also wanted rid of him for those sorts of reasons. I have a little study group that meets on a regular basis, and we studied. We called the group together so that we could talk about this incident in the temple. And the question was, is Jesus a madman, or could he be the Messiah? And so they decided that it would be good for somebody, and they elected me. It's good for somebody to go and see him secretly, because none of us want to be known where, that we might be on the wrong side of things. So they decided that I should go and try and see Jesus at night sometime, and so I did. I felt like a weasel, and I felt also like a kind of a little boy going to talk to a really important rabbi. There was a confusion of feelings that I had when I approached Jesus, and Jesus welcomed me in. And we sat together and we ate and we drank and we discussed things. And he said to me one simple thing, which struck me as surprising. He said, "Nicodemus, you must be born again." Well, obviously, that's not going to happen, is it? I mean, when you think about it, I'm already born. I mean, physically, this can't mean that. And we sort of played around with that notion for a moment. But he clearly made it obvious to me that he meant that something spiritual needed to happen in my life. That surprised me, because here am I. I'm one of the most educated people in the nation. I'm part of the Pharisees group, the most religious group in the nation. I understand the faith, I understand the culture, I understand the tradition, I understand the law. What could he mean? I must be born again. I didn't take it as a kind of an insult. I did take it as a challenge, though. What did this man think that I'd missed out on? And I went away bewildered, uncertain of what to think and what that meant and how I should apply it in my life, or whether I needed to apply it in my life after all. And as I'm thinking about this and puzzling, I become aware of another time when I felt the kind of quiet chiding, the kind of soft criticism that I heard from Jesus. I'd heard that before from somewhere. And my mind went back to when I was a very young student. I was not particularly young. I was developing my priestly skills in the temple, and I was just a young priest, as it were, a young Pharisee, learning the trade, as it were, in the temple, when a commotion began to happen in the temple. I wasn't there at the time, but it appears that this boy who was probably no more than about 12 or 13, bar mitzvah, just very young, had come into the temple, and he began to discuss things with a priest on duty. And then another priest joined in the conversation, and another priest joined in the conversation, and this young lad had such knowledge, such wisdom, such understanding. He asked questions that were deep, and he gave answers that were enough to confuse the most educated person. It had become something of a notable event. And one of the priests came out to where I was studying, as I do, and he said, "Come and have a look at this." So I went back into the temple, and there he was, discussing these deep and meaningful things with the hierarchy. And he came back the next day, and he came back the next day, and he kept it going for all that time until on the third day his parents turned up. They apparently had taken off with their group, from Nazareth as it turned out, their group, who had travelled a day and a half out of the city and realised that he wasn't with the group. He was somewhere else, and so they come back into the city to look for him and finished up turning up at the temple. And this young lad said to his parents this, "Why did you worry? Didn't you understand that I would be about my Father's business? In my Father's house." He chided those parents, as a little boy, chided those parents, just in the same sort of way that Jesus had chided me in that interview. It was the same soft, caring, warm, friendly, loving experience that you couldn't take offence at. And it surprised me, that from all of my background, he had a different understanding of God. He really understood God as his Father. In fact, I really think I heard him use the word Abba in there. Our word for dad, or our colloquial word for father. Not the austere father that we tend to think of when we talk of God. We know God as the God of the culture, of Israel's history, who guides our life, who gives the law. And God's a little bit austere for us. But for him, he was close. It was like as if he was really God's child, or that's the way he saw himself. And I wondered whether this might have something to do with the idea that children are special to God. That's what he seemed to think anyway, that children are special to God. This relationship was something, that kind of relationship was certainly something that I had missed out on. That close filial relationship that feels like I really am God's child rather than God's subject. This whole children theme reminded me of another story, another time, and a much earlier time in my life, when I was but a very young student, about 15 I suppose, still in the temple. I was a good student, and I had a lot of friendly scholars around the temple, really liked me, and they would include me in the things they were discussing. So I got a bit of an advanced education on the basis of all that conversation. Sometimes they had curly questions coming in, and I was part of that group that discussed the curly questions. Well, on this particular day, a message came from the palace. We need somebody to come to the palace and tell us where the Messiah is to be born. And so they looked up the books and they worked it out, and they sent me up to the palace to deliver the message, to tell the king who sent the message down the answer to his query. When I arrived at the palace, a little bit shaky, because the palace, the king at the time was Herod the Great. Now, you don't fool around with Herod the Great. He'd been known to kill nearly everybody close to him, and I didn't feel very secure. But when I got there, I discovered that what had happened was that there were these men who had come from Babylon. These men had come from Babylon because they'd seen a star in Babylon that they said was a star that identified the birth of Israel's Messiah. So they'd gone to the logical place to find a king. They'd gone to the palace and asked at the palace where the baby Messiah was. And the king, of course, knew nothing about that. And so he was a little bit concerned, I think. A little bit concerned about kings being born that he hadn't heard about. And Herod being the kind of person Herod was, that would spark his interest. Anyway, I was brought into this room and there were these really important looking men and the king, who at the time was behaving what I would call extremely well. He was really nice. He was warm. He was friendly. He was gentle with me. He was very hospitable with the very important people. And he said to me, "What's your name?" I said, "Nicodemus." And he said, "Well, Nicodemus, what message have you got from the temple?" And he said, "Well, the scholars have told me to read to you from Micah. But you, O Bethlehem of Ephratah, who are one of the little clans of Judah, from you shall come forth for me one who will rule in Israel, whose origin is from of old, from ancient days. Therefore he shall give them up until the time when she who is in labour has brought forth. Then the rest of his kindred shall return to the people of Israel, and he shall stand and feed his flock in the strength of the Lord, in the majesty of the name of the Lord his God. And they shall be secure, for now he shall be great to the ends of the earth, and he shall be one of peace." Well, the king said to the scholars from Babylon, "There you have it. Bethlehem's your destination. You've got to go to Bethlehem and find the baby. And when you find the baby, make sure that you come back and tell me where he is, so that I can go there and I can worship him too, because this is the most important birth that Israel has ever experienced. If the birth of Messiah has occurred, then we must all praise God and rejoice." Well, there you go. That's what he said. The wise men began to leave, but Herod stopped them by calling out to me, "Nicodemus, would you like to go with these men and show them the way to Bethlehem? Put them on the road and help them find their way." And I was shaking with fear because it was Herod, and I was shaking with excitement because I couldn't not want to go. And so I rushed back to the temple, told the scholars what was going on, and I rushed home, packed a little bag, and found myself on the edge of Jerusalem, pointing these wise people the way to Bethlehem. And we headed on the way, and we travelled all day long, and then the evening came, and they looked to the stars, they looked to the sky, because they did so every night. And there, to their surprise and to mine, there was this bright star in the sky, hanging in the direction of Bethlehem. And so they decided they better travel on in the night. So they travelled on, and during the day they slept, and they travelled on following the star until they came to the place where the star was. And they could identify a house there. And so one of them went to the door and knocked and said to the man who came to the door, "Do you have a baby here, born recently?" And the man said, "Why do you want to know?" And he said, "Because we have seen a star in the east, and we have come to worship the baby, because this baby, we believe, is the Messiah of Israel." And to my surprise, The man at the door wasn't surprised. He opened the door and let them in. And these wise men knelt on the floor in front of a girl who was very little older than me, in front of a rough cradle that was there in the house, and they presented in front of this mother and baby their gifts: gold, frankincense and myrrh. And it amazed me, because these really educated, wise people had gone seeking for a king in the most logical place, which was a palace. And when they had found him in a humble home, they were no less convinced. They worshipped there in front of the child. It is as if they were acting like children. They had become simple in their faith. There was no uncertainty. They knew what they'd seen in the sky. They knew what they understood of that thing in the sky, and they had come and they had bowed in faith, in trust, in the simplicity of the moment. I could see them as children. They were free to love the child, free to offer the gifts, free to worship, free to give of themselves in dedicated ways, free, not law-bound, not controlled. And I found myself also on my knees, because if only Israel could understand a God who comes to them as a baby, who lives like the poor, who understands the human condition, who lives alongside of us. Maybe this is what Isaiah meant when he said, "He shall be called Emmanuel, God with us." This whole new way of seeing God as a loving father who blesses the children, who has children, who wants us to be his child. This is something that I had not experienced. This is a new relationship with God, and maybe if I can have this child born within me, if this new life can begin here with me, I could also experience something of this new way of thinking about God. Jesus said, "I must be born again." Maybe this is what it means.